All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this, our very first Apromore Unplugged LinkedIn Live. I'm super excited to be here for everyone joining us, no matter where you are. We're thrilled to be able to have these conversations here on LinkedIn Live. So this is a new series where basically we'll be meeting with thought leaders in this space to really deep dive on topics in a casual, unplugged manner. So no real scripts here. It's completely organic. But we'll be talking about business and how process intelligence, process mining, AI, and other factors like the market, compliance, and obviously recent headlines can help drive transformative change at organizations. So without further ado, obviously, I am Brandy Sanders. I am the CMO of Apromore. Super excited to be here. And I am actually here with a very esteemed colleague, Nigel Adams, one of our wonderful senior advisors here. A little bit of bio, get ready for the razzle dazzle. Nigel is a trusted thought leader in service operations and excellence with deep experience in the banking sector. He has nearly 25 years of experience focused on creating enterprise value from operational improvement, risk management, and performance optimization, and is also very well known for driving performance and transformational change at pace while leading large multi-award winning teams in complex delivery networks. And lastly, in addition to a consulting career at KPMG, he has brought his skills to bear for leading banks, including NAB, ANZ, all while focusing on global payments and cash operations, financial crime, which we will definitely touch on, and business performance. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us here on LinkedIn Live, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Brandy. Lovely to be here and looking forward to chatting about process compliance.
All right. So this is going to be really interesting and we're going to go right into it. Like we said, there's no scripts. This is going to be slam bamming. So the headlines, there are a lot of them, even in the past 2 quarters. If you go back and you look, compliance, finance fraud, they're making headlines left and right. And this is on a really global level. It's not like just one little area here or there. And no organization that I am personally aware of has ever thought, gee, I'd really love to be the next like LinkedIn headline or the front of the New York Times on cautionary tale hitting that news cycle. 2 examples we will absolutely call out here that I think will be relevant to anyone in finance, compliance, retail, or otherwise. The first one is obviously Macy's. This is recent news. One of America's greatest retail icons last month announced that the company had discovered an employee intentionally hid about $154 million in expenses over the course of nearly 3 years. That prompted the retailer to conduct an independent forensic accounting investigation. This hit New York Times. It's all over the global news. And the employee, who Macy's said is obviously no longer with the company, intentionally made repeated erroneous accounting accrual entries, which to anyone in non-finance is a question mark in and of itself, but they hid small package delivery expenses to the tune of $154 million. And the accounting irregularities were so impactful that the company actually was forced to delay its quarterly earnings report, which in 2024 is kind of a wild statement in and of itself. One more exam that we can come into is in Australia. So there was actually an ASIC investigation, the MTP. So this is Markets Disciplinary Panel for anyone unfamiliar with that market. Fined a leading bank there a record $4.995 million for failing to prevent suspicious orders being placed on the electricity futures market. So to be clear, for anyone new to this, this is the highest penalty ever imposed by the NDP. This isn't just a check mark or a wrist slap. It's huge. ASIC Chair Joe Longo actually said the record penalty imposed by the NDP reflects the very serious, prolonged, and potential systemic failures by this bank to detect and prevent suspected manipulation in the market for energy derivatives. So, and this is the largest market participant in energy derivatives. Given its role as a gatekeeper here, it's their responsibility to ensure that these orders are not permitted to be placed in the market. So right off the bat, just 2 examples, and there were many more, but for the sake of LinkedIn Live, we'll get right to it. Nigel, how does this happen in 2024 is a question that I would have off the top of our mind. We've got automation, process mining, compliance, AI, tools and workflows, all sorts of things there that you would think this sort of thing couldn't go through the cracks undetected. So I am very curious on your expert opinion here on how this is even possible right now.
Oh, Brandy, I mean, what's really interesting about those, the two incredibly different cases, you know, you've got a huge US retailer and you've got an investment bank sort of playing in a futures market in Australia. But there's, you know, so many more. You look at the sort of recent Toronto Dominion sort of case where they were fined $1.3 billion for financial for violations of anti-money laundering legislation. And then you go back a few years in Australia, and the scandals that sort of arose basically from a compliance perspective led to the resignation of 2 chairs and 3 CEOs of 3 of the 4 major banks in the country. So this is big stuff. And what it shows is just how broad the reach is from compliance. And we've got regulatory compliance, we've got codes of industry practice, we've got internal policy that we're trying to capture here. And this is just with sort of, I guess, non-financial risk and processes that we're looking at. We're not necessarily looking at conduct behavior here, but it's very, very broad. And I think the key point for me from your sort of opening there was, 1, it's really hard. Maintaining control is really hard. And 2, it's really expensive. But the choices are, you know, you invest in compliance and control, and you stay compliant, you stay in control, which is great. Or you don't invest in compliance and control, and you end up on the front pages of the financial press. You're paying millions, if not billions of dollars worth of fines. And it's the costs which you don't see on the front pages that really, really take their toll. The fact that you have the scrutiny coming into your organization from external departments, that the whole organization takes their focus off the customer to focus on compliance and control. It's a really, really significant hidden cost. So it's hard. It's expensive. Yeah,
right off the bat, there's also the reputation. Like that is just
the reputation damage is enormous.
Yeah, it's
because it says if you allow your employees to steal money from you of that order of magnitude of 130, 140 million dollars, what else are they not checking? Why? Because I'm the consumer. I'm paying for that. You know, that gets washed through in the margins and the pricing, but I'm paying for that ineffective control of the organization.
Yeah. And I keep thinking about, you know, you mentioned difficulty. And for most people who are not directly involved with this arm of a business, there are assumptions made on compliance, right? Usually it's seen as, you know, burdensome, or I think you had mentioned a term in one of your recent pieces in FinTech magazine that was like, you know, what was it? Bugbear. I think
it's a bugbear. It's a tick the box approach. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this later, how if you change your mindset on what compliance is, it's just another constraint on a process. It's no different to how quickly do I want my customer to receive this particular product or service? How much do I want them to pay for it? How much do I want it to cost me? What's the quality specification? It's just another constraint. But for some reason, we seem to think of compliance as another thing, and it's a burden that's imposed upon us. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I think if I go back to sort of the real question here is, why is it so hard?
Yes.
Well, first of all, we've got to find out what are all we're trying to do with process compliance is make sure that the processes do what the rules ask them to do. Now, it sounds incredibly simple, and in a simple world, it could be. But first of all, what are the rules? There are so many rules. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them. As I said, some of them are regulatory obligations. Some of them are industry practice. You know, this is, for example, how payments are processed in my old world, you know, the SWIFT standards, which specify how you structure a payment. Others are internal policy, you know, what will we do? What will we not do? And so there's lots and lots of different rules. But the tricky thing about it is they're not written in a way that you can check them easily. They have these vague legalistic terms, lots of jargon in them, lots of references to subparagraphs and subclauses. They may conflict with similar rules in different jurisdictions. And you have terms like what constitutes significant or a material change of circumstances. how can you check whether there's been a material change of circumstances? My perception of that may be very, very different to yours. And if you're in a large corporate organization, the retail team may think of it differently to the institutional or the corporate banking team, or the wholesale business may think of it differently to the retail part of the business. So you need to do this interpretation. And what happens in many cases, it's left woolly, it's left ambiguous. But of course, if you're wanting to try and check that a process complies, you can't have woolly. You need specificity.
Mhm.
You need to put it in terms that you can interpret when you interrogate the data. So we've got all this legislation. It's all vague and woolly. It's all ambiguous. We don't know which processes it applies to because we've got thousands of processes. So somehow you've got to do this mix and match. And then once you do the mix and match and you've finally managed to translate the ambiguity into something concrete, you have to map it to the process. And these processes are generating millions of events a day. Now, in the past, when you've tried to check compliance, you've had the auditors come in. They may come in once a year. They grab a few samples of transactions. Yep, it's all looking good. Controls are in shape. Let's move on. That just doesn't cut it. We're looking for a needle in the haystack here. Large organizations, for the most part, are exceptionally well run. But it only takes a handful of sizable transactions or lots and lots of very small ones to create the types of scandals we talked about at the beginning. And so looking for that needle in the haystack, the traditional approaches to trying to address that and find those violating cases, they just don't work effectively anymore.
And this is so interesting because when you say needle, we often would think, oh, well, look for the $1 billion withdrawal, or, oh, look, this is coming from a known area that has, a frequent financial fraud or has a reputation perhaps in finance circles as being problematic. But what we just talked about when we came in were these death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. And more than ever, there's kind of like this level of accountability and, again, complexity and assumptions here, but like making it easier. I think at a very high level, what you're saying is really driven by this codification, right? This codification. Yeah.
And that's where the data point comes in, because so there's two parts of this. On the one hand, you've got the compliance rules, and on the other hand, you've got processes. They're both a mess in most organizations. The complexity, the interwoven web of regulations and requirements and rules versus the spaghetti that our customers and our staff are trying to navigate every day to execute, to deliver to customers. And when you're trying to then sort of match the two together to look for that needle in the haystack, it's not straightforward. And that's where you need sort of different tools to help you manage through that.
Yeah, which I'm going to actually pin that right to the donkey, so to speak. When we talk about tools or solutions or ways of addressing it, like why it's not easy, we've determined that we know there are multiple stakeholders. There are different things that are in there. How do you kind of unravel that bowl of fish hooks in order for it to make logical sense and get an agreement? Like, what are the kind of processes and tools and solutions that we would use for that sort of thing moving forward?
Well, I think there's been a lot of progress, which is great news. So obviously the real financial scandals around Enron at the turn of the millennium led to sort of some changes in regulation, and certainly many large organizations now have risk obligations and controls registers. So they are taking this seriously. They do have governance. And particularly in an area of technology called RegTech, there's been lots of advances in technology companies that go out and extract requirements from source legislation and feed it into these risk obligations and controls registers. And whenever regulations change, they send notifications, they provide the updates. But that's just getting it into your register. You as an organization then need to map it to your processes. But because the governance is in place, it's manual, but at least there's some mechanism. What's been lacking is an ability to interpret the mess of the process in the back. So I recently did some interviews as part of some research where we were looking at banking processes, and people were talking about, we're really, really happy because 8%, we had a 97% straight through processing rate, which means no one touches it. So it's all electronic and it sounds really high. But that particular processor has got 40,000 variations. And so we're getting 97% on a very, very small happy path, not on the whole process. And up until the last sort of few years, the operators of the processor knew that there was so much variation. But in terms of being able to make it transparent, being able to visualize that complexity, how it's all interwoven, we just haven't had the tools. And that's clearly where process intelligence and process mining has made such a huge leap forward in enabling analysts and practitioners to really see the mess that they are dealing with. I think there was quite a famous sort of case in the a Royal Commission that was held in Australia, where one of the CEOs talked about, what people don't realize is that our mortgage process is really complex. There's over 400 steps. And in the commission hearing, there was audible gasps about, wow, we thought it was just really straightforward to just hand the cash over. What the CEO didn't say, it's not the 400 steps that make it complicated or complex. It's the 40,000 variations of how you can navigate those 400 steps. And of course, risk hides in the weeds. It hides at the extremities, on those outlier paths that only happen once or twice or three times. It never materializes or rarely materializes on the happy path. And so we need to be able to see the weeds.
Yeah, this is all about the details. And you mentioned there's the happy path here, and like no one wants to stand up and say, oh yeah, like no, it's not okay. There are assumptions here with those variations. We talk about a lot at Upper Moray perception and reality, like the distinction between, oh yeah, for anyone outside of this process, it looks like it's steps 1 through 5. But it's really, before you get to 1, there are 47,000 other variations on the ask that could distinctly influence the path of success for that area. And mathematically speaking, it quantifies by the billions when you have enterprise level companies, global banks, you've got international, registers that are coming back and forth. It's this ping pong experience where that data could go through 1,000 different vaults, each of which are a distinct level of vulnerability. And the importance you mentioned as well, you have to bring stakeholders together. Like you have to wrangle cats. It takes a lot. This isn't just we randomly sign up for something and then magically everything happens. It's really bringing them in to understand there's risks, there are trade-offs. This is what's compliant. This isn't. Yeah. And I can't help but think so. We are literally mere weeks away from turning the page into 2025. We have these headlines. I know whether it's folks here on LinkedIn who talk to each other at the executive level, or VP, C-suite, finance, compliance, IT, you name it, everyone's thinking about their next quarter. And when we think about key compliance as a need, as a requirement, not as an afterthought, which I think we've talked about already, is the typical way that it gets washed out. Like, oh, we'll get to that. We've got our SOC, or we've got our certain like minimum viable level of protections there. But as you've said, it's always in the weeds. Like if you are talking to a room full of execs and saying, hey, these are the key compliance trends, like what are a few just actionable things that we can think about for them in regards to this world of process that they should be thinking about right now while they're planning for 25, not as an afterthought?
So I'll answer. I'll maybe give a strategic one and a couple of tactical points. So the strategic one is, once you recognize that process underpins the very fabric of how you create value for your customers. And it's a big leap forward for lots of people that are not sort of operational or not manufacturing related. But once you acknowledge that everything we do in an organization to try to create value for our customers is an outcome of 100, thousands, tens of thousands of processes. So those processes, they have constraints which are imposed upon them. And some of those constraints come from our customers in terms of how quickly they want that delivery to be made or how much they're prepared to pay for it. Some come from our staff about what's acceptable practices in terms of working. Some come from our communities and our regulators. Now, we tend to look at those in silos. And if I think back to my days when it was coming up for budgeting season, what we'd get is the product manager would come in and say, look, we've got to deliver this service faster for customers. So let's get rid of all these steps because they just get in the way, and we can maybe get this out in half an hour or an hour or a 5-minute turnaround for this. So you think, oh yeah, okay. So you start to take out some steps. And then the finance guy comes around a week or so later and saying, look, we're looking at our FY25 sort of budgets here, and we're going to need to cut costs by about 10%. So how about you sort of take out, 15% of your resources, but you can reinvest a few over there. So you say, oh, okay, yeah. So you take the people out and the money goes with it. And then a week later, the risk and compliance guy comes around and says, I'm really concerned that the regulator's on our case here. We're going to have to put all these controls back. But I've just taken the controls out when I've got rid of the people and I've got rid of the steps in the process. So you're going round in this loop. If you bring all those connected stakeholders together and you look at the data, and you look at the process, and you start to simulate the choices you have strategically, and then each of those stakeholders can not only see the benefits that they're looking for, but they see the costs and the impact of their decisions. And it's when you walk in the other's shoes that you start to have a much more rounded perspective on what's required. And then that, if you think about compliance in that way, you start to change the culture from being a tick the box bureaucratic add-on to it's just an integral part of how we work. And organizations that get this right will seek a competitive advantage. So that's my strategic one. 2 tactical ones to do between now and the holiday season. First, just do a quick sort of snapshot of your current maturity of your risk management. Have I got all my risks documented? Have I got my obligations documented? Have I got my controls documented? Am I having regular forums? How am I monitoring them? You're doing a maturity assessment. Where am I at? Am I sort of comfortable? Am I getting the right level of seniority? Are the board engaged in this? Are they getting the right data being fed to them? Are my frontline team members aware of their obligations and how they interact? So just do a quick maturity assessment. And then the second one is if you've got something which is a process of concern. It might be a concern because it is such a dominant process in your organization, or it's one that's coming under regulatory scrutiny elsewhere in other organizations. Do what the old operational guys would call a failure modes and effects analysis test on it, which is basically discover your process. Let's get the process model out there. And for every activity you have, list all the possible ways it can fail. Now that's a brutal activity to do. It can be very painful.
I can hear it. I can hear people complaining about it without even being in the room with them.
You're in the naughty corner if you have to go and do this, because you should be coming up with dozens of ways each activity can fail. So a large process can have hundreds, if not thousands, of failure modes. Then once you know how it can fail, you give it 3 ratings, scored out of 10 typically. How likely is it to fail? What is the impact if it does fail? And how likely are you to detect it? So you rate it on those 3 sort of criteria, multiply the 3 numbers together, and you get what's called a risk priority number. And obviously, you start to work on the highest priorities, and you will always find something if you've done it in enough detail. Now, typically, because we've only got half an hour or 3 minutes to look at things, we don't go into the detail. But the risk happens in the weeds. You need to get right down in the detail. And it's an extraordinary tool to highlight where you need to go, because then you've got 3 simple choices. Accept the risk, i.e. do nothing. Mitigate the risk, trying to sort of, put some change or put some controls in, or design it out. And it's both a business sort of tool and a risk management tool woven into one. And for me, that's what compliance is. It's the 2 together. It's how they work in harmony, their yin and yang, that will deliver the value to all our stakeholders, to our shareholders, to our customers, to our staff, and to our regulators.
That is actually a great place to put a pin in it, because I don't think you could have said it in a more harmonious way, from both strategic on high up on the mountain for your executives all the way through tactical. There's a string that goes through the entire organization when it comes to compliance, and especially processes. I often feel people kind of underestimate how much people wrangling and emotion even can go into this. So I love that you touched on both of those, because we all know how hard it is to get those execs at a table for 5 minutes, much less enough time to go through all of the rigor that is really required operationally and process wise for this to be a success. So on that note, we will put a pin in it. Listen, Nigel, it has been phenomenal connecting with you. For anyone watching live or even watching this afterwards, like, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at Apermory. Of always, we'll have a bunch of different things coming out as follow-up for this. If you've missed the live, we'll have it on demand. But Nigel, thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to do this again. I'm quite 100% sure as we launch into 2025, we'll be chatting more here on Apermory Unplugged. And absolutely huge pleasure being here with you and with everyone else here on LinkedIn. Thank you so much, Nigel. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, really enjoyed it, Brandy. Thank you very much, and look forward to doing some more of these.
Thank you so much, everyone else as well. Really appreciate it. Take care, all. Take care.
Bye.